Всем привет, это проект
Hello
Alpha.
everybody, this is Project Alpha. You are watching live War Diary with Alexey Arestovich. Hello Alexey. Hi Nikolai. So let's start with the news that continues to, or is a logical extension of Russian attack on Akhmatdet, the children's hospital. Russian pilot who supposedly participated in that airstrike had disclosed information about his colleagues to Ukrainian intel. Russian pilot of the 22nd Heavy Bombarding Division transferred data to the Ukrainian intel on his colleagues, who are supposedly the ones continuously shooting up Ukrainian cities with missiles, with air-to-ground missiles. RBC of Ukraine got this data from the well-informed source, and according to the source, Russian pilot wrote to the chatbot of Ukrainian intel and delivered data on his colleagues, expressing his concerns on not understanding why Russia is forcing them to attack civilian targets. Now, a question to you, that you know Ukrainian intel departments. What is the purpose of publishing this information? Nikolai, the only reason to publish anything like that is to cover the real source. So this is not a pilot, not from this air group, basically sent the military counterintel in Russia in the wrong direction. However, knowing our people in Ukraine and some of the work, how they do, they could have also published the real data and could have made a much easier search for Russian counterintel to find the leak source. And yeah, there are a couple of really bright, in quotes, individuals in the top of our intel who could do that. But I would say that I do hope that this is not so. I hope this is a smart data insertion. And they also were targeting probably additional stress to exert on the group of bombers, of the pilots, because when they know that somebody is disclosing their personal data, that doesn't help them to work as coherent group. Alexey, how realistic it is that Russian jet pilots can feel the pangs of conscience for carrying out the tasks against civilian targets? Well, Nikolai, most of them are professionals in the worst sense of this case. If the government tells them to shoot up a children's hospital, they will. But there usually is, even in that group, there would be somebody to have concerns over that. That's the people that Intel would always be looking for. Somebody with problems, somebody with concerns and moral and ethics. Or sometimes people come with their initiatives to the Intel, like in this case, supposedly. So, as we saw in the video, the missile that hit the children's hospital, there is some information from Financial Times that in Russia, they've increased the production of Hr1, that same missile that hit the hospital, and by 8 times. And apparently Russia is now manufacturing 420 of them a month versus 56 before the invasion. You're right, why wouldn't they manufacture these missiles if they already have great schemas to deliver the components from France, from China? Sorry for interrupting you. I remember at the beginning of this war, you and the other analysts were saying that Russians have so many missiles left that they're running out of them. So it turns out now that all these gray import schemes and some sort of coalitionary relations between Russia and Iran and North Korea and some other countries have led to the fact that we not only have no deficit now, but we're also exceeding the previous production capacity. Yeah, they have solved the problem of low capacity for missile production. They've undertaken certain effective measures early on, and some of them were rather effective. One of them was that they stood up and said to the Global South that they're representing the Global South in the anti-colonial fight against the West. And they received more support, and so-called Global South is actually aiding Russia quite a bit in terms of components and other products, which enables them to manufacture missiles. Plus, the West also is not completely leak-proof. So, okay, let's look at the, as I would call it, motion towards peace. If after the first summit there was some tendency, some trend that we all saw, that discussions of peace treaty were intensified, right now we're seeing that it's somehow swinging in a different direction. We're not saying now that we want to conduct a second peace summit. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen in August or September timeframe. And what was discussed, that invitations to Russia and other countries were being extended to that summit. Now, apparently, that summit is being planned for November, right when the presidential elections are going to happen in the US. And apparently, Russia is absolutely not going to participate in that, according to some statements. Do I understand it correct that in the potential possibility of freezing this war this year, one can say it's not going to happen? No, I would not say that, Nikolai. We can gauge what's happening now. There are several peace plans currently circulating, and those elements and pieces of them that once in a while bubble up, this is the fight between plans. There is a separate Chinese plan. It has not been voiced and researched in detail, but it does exist. We know that it does. There is Russian plan. There is American, French, Chinese, Russian plan. There is also French-Chinese part of that plan separately. And then there is Ukrainian peace formula. All of them head towards peace. Connecting the second peace summit by Zelensky with invitation of Russian side and connecting that with presidential elections, it does indicate that he is talking about that under pressure. Understandably, Democrats want to show this war as successful record in their external politics and the international politics. Basically, hey, see, we made Putin to shut up and to withdraw. And they exert enough pressure on Zelensky. There are two ways to exert pressure on him. One is to seize support to Ukraine, even without announcement of that. You can just start slow walking it. And second, you can also scare him with the different anti-corruption cases. So second, I guess it might be in the background, but about the first one, that's the Zelensky statement that actually talks about it, that this is happening. Remember when he said that they're looking for weapons for 14 new brigades to go into counteroffensive, but Americans are not providing that. So as always, I was walking around and I saw a newspaper. And that newspaper was saying that Zelensky and his delegation were asking to arm 14 brigades to conduct another big counteroffensive effort. On the other page of that newspaper, in English, it was written, the first one was in Ukrainian. On the second one, according to the NATO summit and NATO analysts, they discerned such an activity, such an initiative of counteroffensive to be very risky. It takes about a year and a half to prepare a brigade for effective actions to be worthy of being used in the offensive. And we got the bloody experience in the Ukrainian first counteroffensive effort. And right now, the situation in parity between the readiness of troops and the equipment and everything, NATO experts are prognosticating that this counteroffensive will not just fail, but will fail bloodily. It'll be a bloodbath. It'll be like second Ilovaisk. To which Ukrainian delegation, according to some sources that I have access to, said, no, it's okay, we'll figure it out, just give us the weapons. And that caused condition close to a big surprise, let's call it this way, in the NATO leadership of the allies. And the plan of the Ukrainian side is as follows, as I understand it. If they give us arms, we will go and conduct counteroffensive effort. If we don't get these arms, we will conduct counteroffensive with whatever forces we have. And some military officers are reporting from the front that there is a wonderful delta between what is being supplied by the West and what actually reaches the front. So apparently we are aggregating some arms somewhere. Also, Russian missile attacks on certain targets do highlight for me that they are aware where these troops and where these resources are being accumulated. So I'm afraid we are indeed preparing this mighty counteroffensive, which will end up in the scenario predicted by NATO. And then there'll be an interesting situation in Ukraine because we'll be facing a total crisis, military, political, social, and everybody will probably come to agreement that after what it might become Ilovaisk 2, that would show everybody that Ukraine is at its limit. It's the end of the line. And these are our plans against which the partners are sending stern warnings to Ukraine that Ukraine needs to go to discuss peace with Russia much sooner than that these events can happen. And according to misspeaks of the president, that's roughly where we are. According to Russian statements, Ukraine is getting ready to counteroffensive as well. When Zakharova came out and they said that they are going to blow up some of the hydroelectric stations, this is the warning. And this is the warning against us attacking and destroying the Crimean Bridge. So they're highlighting that if Ukraine, in the framework of this counteroffensive, are going to destroy Crimean Bridge, then Russia will retaliate with this. And our delegation did speak about the Crimean Bridge and the NATO summit. So Russians are aware of that, and they're sending messages, don't. And they expect that in this case, if Ukraine does counterattack, they repel this attack, they destroy the dams, destroy our energy systems, and they prepare their own big counteroffensive closer to winter. For that, they likely will need to conduct additional mobilization, and Russia is already discussing that. And sometime in late autumn or early winter, they will bring up enough forces to the front to start another counter-offensive on their side, to break the front and to get some advantages of capturing more land. And these advantages they expect to become the full capture of Sabotage district, Lugansk and Donetsk, and maybe additional front reignited on the north near Kharkiv. That is their plan, to force Ukraine by force to peace treaty. So both sides want to force the opponent by force to sit down and negotiate and sign peace accords. And apparently the results of actions of our troops and Russian troops in winter and autumn will bring us to the situation when we shall sit down and negotiate. And apparently we're running out of brain matter on both sides because we want to waste another couple dozen or more dozen thousand of troops to eventually sit down and negotiate, when both sides want to sit down and negotiate. And apparently the parties of war are prevailing on both sides, and they insist on wasting another 50,000 here and there to sit down and negotiate after. As I said, we have to deal with, let's call them children on both sides of the front. Only Russian side is more rational than Ukrainian. So I understand, Alexey, that the main hypothesis of our plan is that during that time we'll continue also hitting their oil refineries and energy systems, right, Nikolai? And their main theory is that they will be able to take out our remnants of electric systems, and then we'll be sitting without electricity, not 1 hour or 2 hours a day, but the whole 24 hours. MI6 recently published information, and it actually did perk the understanding of some experts who know what it means, that Russia is going to target electric systems. And at first they'll finish the transition systems, transmission systems, and then they will destroy the transmission hubs near nuclear reactors as well, so that nuclear stations would not be able to supply their energy to the country at large. So Ukraine will be back to the 17th century with fires and stoves. We'll see who will have enough steam, enough effort to carry out their military aspirations. We can also say that China and France had a different plan to go to a ceasefire on the 15th of July. I think they mentioned 19th, right, between 15th and 19th, but basically connecting that with the beginning of Olympic Games. And then after a month and a half of peace, then nobody wants to reignite the war again, and hopefully we'll go into peace treaty and negotiations. What do I think? I think we will get a hot autumn with a lot of military activity. We'll enter the military campaign in winter as well. During that time, there'll be elections conducted in the United States. After that, there'll be some peace treaty, peace accord between Russia and Ukraine, or at least a ceasefire. And then after elections of Zelensky, there'll be some final agreement about the end of this war between Russia and Ukraine. Putin is legally oriented. He wants a paper, and he wants to sign it with Ukrainian representative. Zelensky, in his mind, is not a legit representative from Ukraine, so he'll need to sign it with a new head of government or head of parliament or whatever. And on our side, Zelensky is saying that, no, we're not going to sign anything with Putin. He is a monster. I want to kill him after Bakhmut and other attacks on children's hospitals and such. So let's find a way to force Putin to surrender to the world power. So that's the plan. Orban, after his voyage to Russia and China, wrote an open letter to European Union where he got really criticized. He thinks that Europe needs to take more initiative upon itself to start peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. And he is saying that if we cannot contain this process and start the peace treaty between Russia and Ukraine, then in the next 2 months we'll be witnessing more dramatic losses and deaths on the front in Ukraine than ever before, quoting his letter. So, in your mind, what can he imply, saying that we'll be witnessing more dramatic losses and casualties than before? Well, exactly that, what I mentioned before. He implies that Russia will intensify attacks on the infrastructure of Ukraine and attacking other goals as well, including more goals in the cities. This is their way of waging war. This is their rationality. Russian task is to break Ukrainian will to resist and to force Ukraine to the peace table with their arms. And for that, they're going to attack civilian targets, energy targets, and of course, the fight on the front. And they, of course, will use our mistakes. If we will start our mad idea with counteroffensive, they will use that to their advantage too. I think this is madness. Speaking of counteroffensive, Alexey, what can it be based on? If we're talking now that on the front line, Ukrainian front is slowly withdrawing, slowly retreating. We are giving up some positions. Of course, if one chooses whether to preserve the personnel or keep the position, the logic tells you that you want to withdraw, and if the position is undefendable, just give it up and find a better one. But it does highlight to me our real capabilities on the front, that we are at a low. So first, the logic would be, Nikolai, for us to keep advantageous positions. Our current situation is that we're keeping whatever positions. Very often we are holding the front, being in a ravine and being an easy target for Russia, when instead we should have withdrawn to the higher grounds or across the river, and Russians will never be able to cross it and to get us out of there. Another piece of news, by the way, that we're facing today is that attacks on brigade commanders have intensified. And there is already some mutiny happening on their level. There is a non-illusory probability that a lower part of our army will mutiny against the higher part of Ukrainian Armed Forces. Because more and more data coming, the brigade commander of 59th, of 41st, and the others, we'll talk more about that. But in this condition, to initiate counteroffensive with new brigades instead of refitting the old ones, this is basically exacerbating the trap that Mariana is writing about, when new detachments do not have enough experience and means to hold positions, and the old ones are being spread too thin and being grinded down to zero. And the second element here is that one needs to be absolutely detached from the reality on the ground. Up in the high command of Ukrainian forces, this indicates that it's a political idea, political decision. It's not based on the capabilities. And it's done in hopes that if we somehow manage better counteroffensive than before, then look how strong we are, and we sit down to negotiate from position of force. And then again, if we fail, then okay, we cannot fight any longer. We need to sit down and negotiate with Russia. So for the top leadership, for political leadership, it's good both ways. Because one needs to understand here that the propaganda train was sped up to such a high degree that in order to stop it, you need to face a serious, heavy catastrophe. And I think this is a very cynical calculation. If it works, great. If it doesn't, just as fine. We'll sit down and negotiate peace. So, in your opinion, this is the only thing that can stop that train of propaganda? Yeah, huge military catastrophe that will become an obvious element showing the country that we cannot pull through in military relation. Well, listen, to go for that is very cynical, to waste so many people. Nikolai, what was happening until now? Do you understand that, according to what military are writing, reporting on their brigade commanders, for about a year we've been doing a meat-type defense against meat-type offensives. And there are a lot of examples on the Ukrainian side where we waste our troops in the same capacity as Russians do, for about a year, plus minus, from the beginning of their counteroffensive. So all those who are not cynical, they are, to say more diplomatically, they are far. somebody is in London, somebody is in the United States. All right, the example of such a defense was Fort Bakhmut, right? Yes. Fortress Bakhmut is connected with the failure of counteroffensive campaign in the south because Zelensky was not afforded to create a third army corps, and 11th that we just did not have enough resources to do. All these forces that were supposed to have been forming those units were just sent to Bakhmut and were burnt there. And Syrsky, who was commanding the ground forces, he actually sent the most experienced ones towards Bakhmut and wasted them there. And in the south, we did not have enough of the experienced troops to carry out. And since then, that's the phase of decline that we entered. But we're continuing in the same logic, of course, because we are the strongest, the most glorious, etc. You understand it yourself. Now let's talk about the NATO summit and other estimations of its outcomes. We understand the overall framework, but still, do we have anything worth highlighting from the good news? Sorry, there will not be good news except for $40 billion that was promised from NATO countries. Another interesting news, direct accusations of China that China is a force behind Russia that is using Russia as a proxy force against the West. This is a precious resolution because before, of course, China was united as a strategic partner of Russia in different publications and concepts, but it is the first time when they're putting it as the force behind Russia, and Russia is basically a proxy force of China. While China, Global South, and Russia are accusing Ukraine of being the proxy of the West suggesting an alternative vision where they're accusing Putin of being a proxy force for China. Interesting turn of events. Behind the scenes, that was discussed for a while. That's exactly how it was seen, but it's the first time put on paper. Also, $40 billion is quite a lot. It is not 60 that Americans gave, plus 30 from Europe, but it's at least 40 from the NATO countries. They'll be separate from EU and from the United States. That will enable Ukraine to continue remaining afloat. We're realizing the same principle here. We see that realization by United States and the allies that we will not let Ukraine lose and we will not let Putin win. That's the positive. Out of negative, we should dispel the illusions of Ukraine joining NATO at the end of this war. We might get an invitation, but we will not be added to NATO. Because everybody understands in NATO that Ukraine in NATO implies that it will be a war with Russia. And Russia is continuing to demonstrate that. So you will see a lot of assurances given to Ukraine. Nobody will say that Ukraine will not be welcome in NATO. People will be saying that, of course, there will be different options for Ukraine to join, maybe decades later, but very likely this will not happen in the foreseeable future. One should notice that there are several officials who are giving a very precise signal, like President of Czech Republic Pavel, who is saying, well, no, there'll be no NATO, but we'll give you extra ammo, extra shells. The head of NATO, Stoltenberg, also said that we cannot give exact time frame when Ukraine will join NATO. So we're being told by official message of the NATO summit and also by all these slips and intended slips that there'll be no NATO for Ukraine. That something needs to change in the world globally for Ukraine to seriously be considered in that military alliance. And even about European Union, there is not enough assuredness now. And Ukrainians need to understand that really well. Unfortunately, as a nation, we are not understanding, we're refusing, and we are still going in the direction that we will destroy Russia, and the West one day will awaken and will join us in this fight. The West has a scenario where they do join the fight, and they're highlighting those scenarios officially and unofficially. First is if Russia is using nuclear weapons against Ukraine, then NATO countries will attack Russian troops in the occupied Ukraine with conventional forces. And second is if Russia attacks NATO members. And the third, if Russia manages to collapse the Ukrainian front and rapidly advance towards Dnieper. And then there are plans to bring in NATO troops to pause Russians on Dnieper, because in their framework they see it then as the border of a new Iron Curtain against Russia. So are they implying that NATO forces will be on the left or on the right bank? On the right bank, and they will not let Russians cross it. Right. Peter Pavel said as follows, that it is an unreal task to push Russia out of the occupied territories that they captured in Ukraine. He criticized the metaphor of a bridge to NATO, and he highlighted the impossibility of the task to recapturing or liberating the territories back for Ukraine. From the technical standpoint, Ukraine has one of the biggest armies in Europe, and they're sharing very precious experience that is being shared with NATO allies. Pavel also noticed that if Ukraine will remain in a shadow, in a gray zone in Europe, it will create additional basis for instability on the eastern side of Europe, and NATO should do whatever they can to bring Ukraine closer to the alliance and perhaps help it to integrate in some fashion. So how do we understand that? Shadow side, help to integrate, what does he mean? Well, first let's start with a metaphor, a bridge to NATO. Remember, United States made an official statement that Ukraine will join NATO when it will prevail, when it will win over Russia. Read as never. This is a form of sort of picking on Ukraine. Shadow zone, gray zone, is basically de facto being integrated with NATO, not even having a status of Israel and Jordan, but have some relations with NATO. And the gray zone will remain in the fashion that NATO will continue helping us by training, by equipment, providing technology, but NATO will not even give us a status of a special partner, because for them this is crossing the red line in the framework of overall strategy of containing Ukraine and Russia in the conflict. So basically turning Ukraine into some sort of Afghanistan, maybe more organized, a bit more civilized, but this is a transparent, simple message. And one should note that Peter Pavel is the ex-head of the military branch of NATO, who was in charge of military use of NATO forces. He's the one who knows all secrets of NATO, literally. And this is his viewpoint. And I would also add here that he has a proclivity to express himself in a very direct fashion. Right, in a very military style, right? Directness. Okay, there was also a statement by President of Romania that Ukraine received only about the half of promised aid. President of Romania, Klaus Iohannis, had made this statement, and verbatim it was European countries provided only roughly about 50% of what was promised. It was acknowledged that in order for Ukraine to prevail in this conflict, more needs to be transferred. So basically highlighting the fact that Western countries are denying Ukraine a victory in this conflict. Right, on one hand, they are denying this, on the second, they can't. Keywords here, promised, means that the Western allies promised that they'll be delivering certain nomenclature to Ukraine. Ukraine was building its plans based on this, but it's not a secret anymore that at the beginning of our counteroffensive, we requested only about 10 different articles, but NATO summarily completed their promises only to about 18%. That was the best percentage. The average percent was 9 to 12%. That was also, of course, a political decision, so we understand it. I don't know how else to explain it to some elements of our audience, but many Ukrainians live under the paradigm that I'm eager to deceive myself. NATO is already verbatim telling us, winking and nodding and making direct statements that no, your wants will not be appreciated, will not be supported. But still, we have a big chunk of our society who are hoping that NATO will awaken and Russia will be defeated. That's kindergarten, gentlemen. All right, we had a statement by Lukashenko as well, the previous week, that Ukraine have withdrawn troops from the border, and that's why Belarus is also removing their troops from the border with Ukraine. Ukrainians are not our enemies, according to Lukashenko, and yet it appears that the statement was made only exclusively for the Russian audience. In a higher degree, it is conveying the message that Ukrainian troops are being removed or withdrawn from the border with Belarus. And Budanov actually commented to the media about the threats of possible invasion from the north. Well, Nikolai, Belarus army is incapable of advancing onto our territory for different reasons, but basically they don't have enough troops. Russian army does not have extra troops to open northern front. But Belarus was actually commenting, Belarus sources were commenting on certain maneuvers of Ukrainian troops who were noticed in the offensive on Belgorod district. Now they are regrouping by the border of Belarus. They failed to understand why those maneuvers were done, and they brought their own troops to the border. That crisis lasted for a while. Lukashenko is now coming out and saying that, okay, we will live in peace, Ukrainians are our brothers. And I think there was unofficial agreement reached between two parties about withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from the border. And of course, Belarus is about to remove their troops as well, or has already started that. So a direct question here, Alexey. Armed forces of Ukraine, some parts of that, those that were on the border with Belarus, could they have moved those troops to the Eastern Front instead? Well, they could have been different things. They could have actually picked people from the front, thrown to the Belarus border, and now moved them back to the front. All right, good. How do you gauge diversion capabilities? Let's say, what if some of the saboteurs reach the territory of Ukraine from Belarus and cause us damage? Basically, can we be infiltrated? So far in Sumy and Chernigov districts, there have been quite a bit of disturbances and those kind of activities, and they only go as far as 5 to 10 kilometers. You can go only as far, and it's only in the mythology that you can successfully go and do things. In reality, it happens very often, as in the movie The Star, where the diversion group is being discovered, and while dying, they manage to still send the data to the hot blonde girl officer on the radio. Then the last of them perishes. In reality, Russians have tried a lot of things. Even the graduates of a special training school in Novosibirsk, they were better trained than Ryazan. They tried to graduate and basically do certain tasks there. There were special groups of specially trained, special center of FSB, Senezh and the rest. And all of that ended very pathetically for them. Of course, they succeeded in perhaps killing a couple of border guards and destroying some of the vehicles, but most of them were intercepted and destroyed. And out of their successes, they presented a lot of videos that were staged. You can see that the video, some of them leaked and they were staged. And our raids into their depth also very often finish in dead specialists. So I'll give you some sad numbers. The norms from the Soviet times. If you try to cross the front line or the border, out of 10 groups, only one has a chance to cross. In the ideal conditions, if it's perfect situation, you get 3 across. If everything is awesome, only one of those 3 comes back. So those people are kamikaze. They're the dead ones. That is the diversion activity across the front line or the border. And losing high-trained, high-prepared special forces experts, to train which a lot of money were spent. It took quite a bit of time to train them to just perhaps shoot some forester on a bicycle and then be captured by counter-terrorist, counter-diversion groups. That's too expensive of a toy. All right, we had this week another statement, a very interesting one. Radio Freedom, CNN, and some others posted information that United States and Germany have prevented the plan of Russia to kill the head of German corporation Rheinmetall. As it is stated, the order by Russian forces to execute Armin Paprik, the head of Rheinmetall, was stopped, and he came out and also said that he believes the information that he was provided. So it appears that Russia still has quite important and significant capacities to conduct these activities, basically a military type of actions. How realistic it is? How do you gauge it? I don't think that all these sources allowed themselves to just fantasize about this event, because Rheinmetall is one of the biggest military manufacturers in EU, and the nomenclature, the items they make, is fantastic. What they're supplying to us, to other countries. So that person is the head of the most important military manufacturer in the whole West. And nobody would have mentioned his name and bring him up to the media without a serious threat. There were also other information leaked that Russian authorities were trying to execute the president of Serbia. And remember, in the news there was danger in Serbia, special operations, etc. So first of all, yes, they restored this practice that was stopped back in 1975 after the Helsinki agreements, when NATO countries and Soviet Union agreed to coexist peacefully instead of remaining in a military contest. And I think it was back in 2010 when this special department was formed again in Russia, military intel, GRU, and they started to perform liquidations or executions of different persons abroad. Second, about Russia having forces in EU and in the West in general. Western press periodically publishes information that Russian special services are activating their operations. Back in 22, all those who were known, they were thrown out. But then with refugees and by other means, a lot more came in, who are trying to realize different projects, including a direct project on executing, liquidating very important persons, such as director of Rheinmetall. Therefore, I tend to believe these statements, especially when it comes from high-level and different sources in both the United States and in Germany. I would remind that last week, American bases in EU were brought to a highest level of readiness because of possibility of Russian terrorist actions. Russian understanding of hybrid war includes these methods too. They are rather successful in liquidating those people whom they considered to be traitors, like Litvinenko and those who fought in Chechnya against them. And now they are getting more appetite and starting to threaten even the leaders of NATO, leaders of EU. That really highlights the fact that Russia is a hybrid threat for NATO countries. That was communicated in a resolution of NATO countries. And they have now to acknowledge that Russia has their crosshairs on the leadership of different organizations in NATO. So what does it mean for NATO? Nothing really much. Nikolai just will emphasize and strengthen the protection over certain military objects. They will increase the security detail with the VIPs. And for example, in Poland, they are now allowing the bodyguards to use live ammo in defending their border. In Soviet Union, that was a norm. But this week, there was incident when a deserter was shot about 30 kilometers away from the border, and bodyguards are saying now that he attacked somebody. That's in Ukraine, and the investigative commission is figuring out the details. And Poles had more of a police type of guarding their border, and of course using machine guns, rifles, and live ammo. That was a very serious escalation. So they used to just capture and try to do other methods of neutralizing the intruders. But now they actually are legitimizing the use of live ammo. And if you remember, a few weeks ago, one of the Polish bodyguards was killed by those who are crossing the border into Poland. So slower and slower Iron Curtain starts to unfold not only alongside the Eastern Front in Ukraine, but also on the border of Ukraine with Eastern Europe. They have to increase the amount of counterintelligence activities they do. There were also 5 cases mentioned in the bulletin. I think there were more, but 5 were read recently when tools like Novichok were used against different activists of Russian opposition and people related to them already in the EU. And that's since the summer of 22, so just throughout the 23 and half of 24. New Patriot systems will definitely help, but they're not enough still, said President Zelensky. He thanked the United States for delivered systems, but outlined that, unfortunately, this is not enough to provide effective protection for the whole Ukraine. In Germany, they're also discussing support and supplying Ukraine with new air defense systems. Unfortunately, they also will not cover the whole territory of Ukraine. Here's the map that Bild has published. New Patriots and Sabotage will not be able to protect Kharkov, Sumy, Nikolaev, and Chernigov. This is the conclusion that Julian Röpke and Australian politologist Carl Gressel came to. According to their data, there are a couple of Patriots protecting skies over Kiev. One is covering Lvov, another Odessa, and 3 more Patriot systems were promised, and also Italian Sabotage are on the way. According to experts' opinion, they may be used towards Dnieper, Kryvyi Rog, Vinnytsia, and future F-16 base in the western of Ukraine, outlined in green. Unfortunately, they will not be used closer to the border, too close to the front, where Russian intel by drone is very well established, and the probability of these systems being destroyed by Russian weapons is significantly higher. In order to solve it, Ukraine would probably need to use missiles and drones and other measures to attack targets on the deeper of Russian territory inside of Russia. So it's hard to comment that, Nikolai, right? It's all correct. Right, Alexey? It appears that nobody wants to place the systems closer to the front. Nobody wants to move them close to the front line because, first of all, they're being destroyed. And second, there is a whole wave of new prohibitive messages by Brits who are also now saying don't use storm shadows on the territory of Russia proper. And Americans have also repeated that there is no permission to use ATACMS on the Russian territory. So what's happening? What's the logic of our needs and their relations with what we are given? Is it acknowledged that Russia can continue attacking unshielded territories of Ukraine and there is no way to stop them? Well, they're not thinking in the category of law, our partners. They're thinking in the categories of modeling. They understand that Russians have increased their capability for intel gathering using long-range UAVs. That's why we saw attack on the train in Kharkov district and some other airfields also. So they have a fleet of UAVs that is more effective, that can fly up to 100 or even 200 kilometers. And of course, they also have 100 to 200 kilometers number of juicy targets that are involved in shelling Ukraine and sending missiles on Ukraine, but we unfortunately cannot reach them. Now, NATO has promised a little bit of additional means and equipment that is considered to be troops, air defense systems, the ones that can be used exactly on the front. And they were discussing perhaps we should buy some of the Tukans, some of the Brazilian storm fighters that can intercept Russian missiles. Perhaps we should have done it a long time ago. We know that over EU they're using some other jets to shoot down the UAVs, including some of the smaller airplanes, and that was tried even before the war. So for the needs of that air club that I belong to, when I was training before the war, it can be used. There also were a lot of licenses that you need to get. There was no big war, so it was more restrictive. But there are different ways to address those. Research shows that such a system as Patriot, which has a very distinctive configuration, the lifespan of this system, if discovered by Russia, by opponent, will probably be several minutes. And Mariana Bezuglia published how Russians were destroying some of our systems before. And according to the words of Deputy of Defense Committee, Ukraine has made several unfortunate mistakes that led to destruction of very expensive and important systems like Patriot. So for the West, I see three logical points here. First is anti-advertising, when these complexes are being destroyed live on camera. And Western military-industrial complex works as a commercial entity which still wants to gain profit, so anti-advertising is not good for them. They wanted advertising, so that was a good advertising that the Patriot can shoot down ballistic missiles. That's great, right? But when it is shot on only in some percent of cases, when Ukrainian officers with more experience can use it against those targets, others cannot, so this is a worse of an advertising. Second, they're not transferring these complexes, because their military are screaming that, we do not have enough to defend ourselves if we calculate future conflict, possible conflict with Russia and China. Simple example, American military, when politicians are saying, hey, we have 1,100 of Patriots, can we transfer perhaps 25% of that to Ukraine? 25 complexes, not 25%. I would say we would need 50 or 60, but okay, let's have it. Let's say 25. And their military experts are saying, no, this will disrupt our capability to defend ourselves, and they're refusing to transfer. So this is not politicians who are damaging us in this regard. This is Western military specialists. Politicians damage us in a different fashion by limiting the use of those military munitions that were given, that disallow us to use them on those Russian jets that are continuing to attack Kharkov from the nearby or near border airfields. And Russia has outlined that if Ukraine will be using ATACMS missiles on Russian airfields, Russia will use most extreme measures to retaliate. And that threat was more than enough, unfortunately, that our NATO partners have weighted the dangers and said, okay, this danger is higher than this one, so we cannot allow Ukraine to use our arms, our weapons on the Russian territory. So in other words, Putin is rather effectively influencing the decisions of the West, moving the red line and affecting the system of negotiations that exists about this war and its possible outcome. Now, to remedy this bitter pill, I want to say that Putin also has some red lines that are affected by the West, for example, the use of nuclear weapons. So this is a mutual story where both sides are exchanging some of the red lines and ultimatums. And while they're threatening each other, Kharkov and other places are getting bombed. Unfortunately, this is how the war works. And I can feel physically the rage of some of our viewers, but my message to them is, guys, we need to grow up. This is how the world works. We need to understand one thing. Let's make a step away from this picture. The West is conducting a very rational warfare where everything is negotiated and calculated. Ukraine is conducting irrational warfare. And doing so, they surprise both Russia and the West. And of course, we do feel the pain. But given that the war that Russia is waging against us, we very often are mistaken about the measures that need to be taken, the outcomes, and the engagement of the West. And one needs to acknowledge that the group that is so upset and so pissed about the West, they do understand the situation better. And they do understand the logic of the West. They do not really understand the logic of Russia, though. There was a bit of research in Ukraine. What do we as Ukrainians understand or not understand about this war? First of all, this research was dedicated to negotiations. The Weekly Mirror, Ukrainian publication, was conducting it. War or peace? Ukrainians want to bring the borders of 91 back, but with whose hands? And sociology establishes certain paradoxical relations among the answers. So let's bring the first slide. Do you consider military victory of Ukraine in the war with Russia? Sorry, this is not the first slide. Let's maybe get to the first slide if we can. This is also not the first slide. So the first one, title of it, do you think it is the time to officially start negotiations, peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine? 43.9 say yes, 35% say no. Can we bring that slide up? Here Nikolai is having some problems in the studio when slides refuse to pop on the screen. If anything, we can read through it, right? Okay, so 49 yes. How much no? 43 are saying, 43.9 are saying yes. 35.0 no, 21% undecided. So almost 10% are prevailing with the opinion that it's time to negotiate. 20% are keeping it on the wind and figuring out what to do, and 35% are saying that no. So this is the influence of Ukrainian modern propaganda on the collective psyche of Ukrainian citizens. 43.9, almost 44% have finally made friends with reality, and 35% are resisting against reality and living in the different reality. 21% don't know what to do. Right. And with this, let's bring the next slide if we can. In October of 22, President Zelensky published an order about refusing to negotiate with Putin. Do you think this order should be repudiated for possible peace negotiations? 31% think that the order needs to be cancelled. 37% against it, 31% undecided. So here we still have a growth of schizophrenia in our society. Where does schizophrenia come from? From difficulty to acknowledge reality. And it's difficult for people to acknowledge reality due to three reasons, because first of all, official and unofficial propaganda is ill with the victory of Ukraine and the borders of 91. Second is that people absolutely refuse to understand, and they do not have much negotiations, much discussions in the public sphere about what peace treaty can look like. But unfortunately, the truth that they will learn eventually and real audit of what has happened with the country will be taken as the total catastrophe when they learn of those details. And it will be a catastrophe for the idea of the Second Ukrainian Republic, of the Ukrainian self-governance. So these people are trying to push this moment as far as they can, trying to live in this fantasy world, just being afraid of the reality. And there is also a group that are closer to rationality, thinking that these negotiations can be conducted without having Zelensky and Putin interact directly, like Istanbul format. And that's a significant portion of society that also consider that. So propaganda is effective. And I can say it's not effective because it's being made by smart people, but because the alternative to what is being sent in propaganda is much worse, and people are grasping at straws. And the third question was, do you think the victory over Russia militarily is possible? 65%, 65.6% saying yes, that Ukraine can prevail militarily, 16.2% saying no. So, okay, look, 65.6% saying yes, meaning that people are afraid to answer honestly to this question. Because how does that correlate with the need to discuss peace negotiations? We will have about 20-something% difference. Where does this variance come from? So I would say that these are respondents who are just scared to answer the truth. There are 16 brave ones who managed to gird their loins and acknowledge the truth, and the rest are just scared. And the atmosphere in society is such that freedom of speech is non-existent at the moment. That's one. Perhaps another part is sincerely misguided, reading a certain media that is just a little more of the organized effort, a little more of the Western help, and Russia will exhaust itself, and so on. And perhaps listening to different Russian economists who are saying that Russian economy will collapse rather soon. So yes, people still believe in military victory. I am really trying to recreate the chain of thought in this case. And I think one can build certain logical construct let's say Russia is exhausting itself, perhaps the aid will increase. Both of them are somewhat fictional, but I think the main driver there is the fear to acknowledge that no. Because the moment you acknowledge the reality, you may start asking yourself, what did we fight for? Why did we lose so many people? Why did we get our economy so much destroyed? Because Russia, occupying our territories, acquired at least 3 million people by that action. And Ukraine lost 20 million of those who fled the country. At least 12, that number I've seen. So we're facing a demographic catastrophe, and Russia has added population and territory. Then the question is, what did we fight for? Why are we suffering? What are we closing the eyes for? Donating money to military and the government? Why the government is destroying our freedoms, our freedom of speech? Why is it violating our constitution? Guiding its actions by the presumption of guilt, throwing people into the drafting commissions and those special buses. And the question is, as in that movie, am I a scared thing or do I have rights? For Ukrainians, the answer today is, I'm a scared thing and I have no rights. And then one starts to ask more questions of oneself, which are more scary than the answers, the questions they can ask of the government. Then, how am I in this situation? What did I invest my attention into? What was I supporting by silence or maybe openly? These are the questions that people are afraid of. I have said that before, that legitimacy of our current governments and Zelensky as a president at the helm and the whole Second Republic, basically, this is all hinging on the threat, on the fear of total catastrophe that may happen if we acknowledge the reality. And Ukrainians are living now, a lot of our citizens are living now with that fear. Because economic catastrophe, we can survive. Georgia, before Saakashvili, was living without electricity. They were using wood, firewood to cook food. Not the best life, but you can get through. But the catastrophe of your opinion and values, that's difficult. A simple example, the number of PTSD veterans who suicided themselves after returning back from Afghanistan and Iraq. In America, veterans are usually praised, but 22 of them were finishing their lives a day because the difference between what they've seen and what they've done in Iraq and Afghanistan and what they've seen in the United States was too big to process. So I'm predicting that Ukrainians will be facing a similar catastrophe. It's already here. It is just a black abyss covered by a very thin layer of patriotic screams and pictures. And people are still continuing trying to convince themselves that the enemy will be defeated and we will win. This is not so. And the earlier we understand that this is not so, the sooner we will push ourselves from the bottom and we'll have a chance to actually get afloat. I think that's why these pollings are not exactly relevant, because they only show that we are closing our eyes collectively as a society because it's too scary to keep the eyes open. This is a medical answer, psychological answer. This is not the answer to the matter. The authors of this polling, they just highlighting that they discovered a certain paradox. That first, Ukrainians are ready to negotiate, but not ready to give anything up. There are additional slides about conditions. What are minimal conditions for peace treaty with Russia? 51.5% are saying that Ukraine needs to be liberated from Russian troops all the way to the borders of 91. 25.8% are for liberation of Ukraine and returning the borders of February of 22. And only 9.4% accept the probable answer as the fixation of the border alongside the front line at the beginning of this negotiation process. There is another paradox here, Nikolai, in the next slide. I don't know if we have it, but I know what it is. There, 46% think that we should not be attacking those who refuse to serve. So look at this. Half of our people want to liberate the country to the borders of 91, but 46 do not want to blame the refusers, then who's going to liberate the country to the borders of 91? Right. Second paradox is that Ukrainians want to liberate the country to the borders of 91, but still don't think that it is shameful to refuse from fighting. Yes, Nikolai, that implies that Ukrainians are living in a separated reality, divided reality, which is a great example of doublethink by Orwell, when you know one thing, but you believe and say out loud something else. In this regard, USSR has not disappeared. This is a classic USSR 2.0, when at home we're laughing at the Communist Party decisions, and then the next day we take Soviet flags and go to a demonstration and show our solidarity with the party. Same thing in Ukraine right now. These answers are revealing it 100%. Because if half of our net population, 51%, want to liberate the country to the borders of 91, then they should be at least acknowledging that the refusers are evading an important service to the country, that it is shameful. And in reality, we have people who are saying, well, no, this is not shameful because government is not functioning well, and people on big breaks of history process, they need to think about themselves first. So that means that Ukrainian separates himself from the state completely. Those 46%, half of our society essentially, are saying that the state exists separately from us, and the state needs to solve the task of getting the borders of 91 back, but please do not bother me with this task. And I can understand those who refuse to serve, and I do not blame them. I do not participate in this. We are not blaming each other who refuse to participate, but we want you, the state, to return the country back to those borders. That implies that society, at least half of our society, is denying government aspirations to have them involved in these processes. And we cannot, of course, in this case, talk about the joint fight of government and society against the eternal Russian enemy. Remember, I said that in the field, in the movie of the People's Reservist, I think it was second clip. Yeah, it was the second piece. Exactly, that there is a war being waged between Ukrainian state and Ukrainian people. Yes, you did say that we're fighting on three fronts. And, okay, so right now, 46% do not want to partake in this. And government, in the face of current leadership, is saying, no, we'll run to 91. And then people are saying, of course, 91 is good, but please, me and those people who are fleeing the country across Tisa River, we do not want to participate in that. This is my right. This is the sign of a split in the consciousness and subconscious of Ukrainian people. And that's basically a sign of schizophrenia. And when I'm saying that Ukraine is a madhouse, it's not an attempt to call names. This is essentially understanding and acknowledging the fact of reality. And these slides are the proof of it. And this will continue for a while. And now going back to the topic of possible military catastrophe, or at least acknowledged possibility of military catastrophe, to suddenly collapse these charts, to have people who would be ready to start sign peace accords along the existing front line will increase. This is the authors of the plan, or those people who are planning this somehow, they acknowledge this possibility because they understand that this train needs to be stopped. I started about a year and a half ago against propaganda. I was making statements because it was obvious that one day it will serve a really bad service to our people. That this propaganda train, so heavy and so fast-moving, will not be able to be stopped fast, except for using very extraordinary measures and spilling a lot of blood. This was obvious to me about a year and a half ago, and I started talking about it back then, that such a huge propaganda effort will result in a horrible hangover of those who believed it, and second, that it will be stopped with extraordinary measures. Examples of those measures: the mutiny of some military after the peace treaty, with the need to physically eliminate those military by the other branches of military. So one warriors of light will be fighting against the other warriors of light. This will be the price we'll pay for the propaganda machine. And all that is a rather rational scenario, by the way. And before that, there likely will be some very bloody events on the front. And this is also the price of propaganda, because those people who are leading our country are not reserved. They're not in the middle. They're jumping on the very extreme point of view. And unfortunately, we are removing an opportunity for us to go down the middle. So, okay, Alexey, if we take regional separation, it does appear that the majority of people who want the borders of 91, who want the victory over Russia, are people living on the west of Ukraine. And the majority of people who are talking about that in their surroundings, in their circles, there are those who are refusing to serve. And apparently the biggest numbers of those are also on the west. So the west of Ukraine is reaching both. 17% in the west of Ukraine are saying that they have friends and family members who are refusing to serve. Right, we had quite a few of those who refuse to serve in three districts, three westernmost districts. That's understandably. People from the west of Ukraine do not quite understand why would they be dying for Bakhmut if even locals do not really appreciate them. What should they be dying for? For what, to what people from Kiev who author certain Telegram channels, they're trying to explain to the Western Ukraine that this is our joint country and we have to be together. And I hope we'll touch upon the topic of language later today, because it does relate to the perverted picture of the world or differences between different views. So in 2014, there were 89 volunteer detachments created, battalions and different caliber ones. Out of them, only one commander was from the west. The battalion Prikarpatia that left Ilovaisk without orders and was caught later. The rest were from center and from the east of Ukraine, because it is on the east of Ukraine where people know what danger is emanated from Russia, by Russia, and how dangerous is so-called Russian world for Ukraine. These are people with their own identification, which has unique features, which allows the celebration of 9th of May, the Victory Day from the Second World War, which allows Moscow Orthodox Patriarchy to be present. But these are the people who rose to defend Ukraine back in 2014 en masse. And most personnel were also from the east and center. And I would say in my personal experience, I have not met such a quality of Ukrainians as Ukrainians from Donbass. Those were people who are dedicated to Ukraine. They have their own regional differences, and they do understand and did understand the danger coming from Russia. Even in that smaller framework, when Russian criminality was trying to invade into Ukrainian economic interests back in the 90s, Ukrainian criminals even pushed back and repulsed the Russians, understanding how difficult and dangerous it's going to be. These people found themselves to be most repressed, most lied about, and most suppressed in their rights in the country. Their self-identification was consciously broken or attempted to be broken by the government. They were spat upon when they took the arms to defend Ukraine from Russia because they were speaking Russian. And to end it, Putin came as well with military and started killing them. And understandably, okay, that's external enemy when they come in and start killing us, and them, of course, being on the right flank, get the brunt of it. But when we are killing them, when we are destroying their self-ID, how do you explain that? I had a lot of experience dealing with guys from Donetsk and Lugansk. They always try to stay true to their word. They have a high level of technical thinking because that was the industrial area of Ukraine. A unique engineering school, take New Kramatorsk plant that can build anything from Death Star to nuclear submarine if you task it with. So people who carry a unique combination of character and knowledge. And they're the most suffered part of our population. And even up to today, the lowest amount of refusers are in the eastern Ukraine. And let's put it this way, there are regional differences. They're based on different ideological platforms that exist. We have at least 3 different Ukraines, we talked about that. We have the west of Ukraine, we have the center of Ukraine, and we have the south and the east of Ukraine. 3 different Ukraines with different ideology. For the west, the ideology says that the monument to Catherine the Great in Odessa is a spit into Ukrainians' face who are dying under Russian bombs. But for people from Odessa who are fighting in the armed forces of Ukraine with Moscow attackers, Catherine is okay because she was the founder of their city. And Potemkin is fine, Duke Potemkin, and Vorontsov, without whom Odessa probably would not have been there. the question, how do you solve that? How do you resolve all these contradictions without spitting into each other's backs, without hacking at each other? The answer is simple. That's my answer. Fifth project, a symphonic project where from different platforms you take different features, you take the better features from each platform. And if we continue pushing mono-ethnic, monocultural project, the further regionalization and separation and division of Ukraine will exacerbate. And on the backdrop of this war, we'll see conflicts on the ideological background, language and cultural fueled conflicts. I can quote you from one officer from Kharkov. Do you want to? He sent me a letter when we were live on air. Hang on. He's the person who is fighting for Ukraine since 24th of February. He took arms and is fighting for our country. Here. He is from Kharkov. So now Kharkov is inhabited by all the people from little villages and other places of Ukraine who drink, who speak only Ukrainian, who attack sales clerks at stores for speaking Russian, and catch people on the street asking glory to Ukraine, waiting for an answer, for the right answer to that. And he's saying one day the spring will shoot. And that's a military officer who is fighting with arms on the front. Because, you know, if a girl or kids will be attacked like that in his presence, it may cause an avalanche of a lot of other stones. End of part 1.